Hey, we'd like to welcome everybody to the Pleasant View Planning Commission for August 3rd, 2023. It is 6:01, and so we'll go ahead and call to order our meeting. We'd like to start with the Pledge of Allegiance and opening prayer, reading or expression of thought by Commissioner Gosner, and go ahead to that point. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful to gather together tonight as representatives for our city and our community. Thankful to live in a free land and in a city where the citizens and visitors care about our area and want to see the best things happen for us. Thankful for all of the city employees and the managers and all of the time that goes into making a functioning city that is largely unknown by the people living here. Thankful for the beauty of this area, for thy hand in our lives, for hope, and for willingness to cooperate and to make good things happen in our city. Pray for thy spirit to be with us and for all those who visit and pass through, that they might enjoy the time they spend in Pleasant View. And this is our prayer in the name of our Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you. Everybody here has had a chance to review the meeting agenda minutes for tonight. Is there anyone that needs to make a declaration of conflict of interest? Hearing none, we'll go ahead and move to item number 2, which is meeting minutes approval. We're thankful we're starting to get caught up a little bit on our minutes, and so hopefully everybody's had a chance to review the consideration for approval of April 21st, 22, August 4th, 2022, September 15th, 2022, December 1st, 2022, January 5th, 23, and March 2nd, 23 for minutes. Are there any changes or recommendations for changes or updates to the minutes as read?
I have an update. Wow, that's loud. On the attendance roster, I'm not listed on 4 of those months. I was actually in attendance on March 2nd and September 15th and was excused on December 1st and August 4th.
Perfect. With that being noted,
Similar along that line, I already emailed Miguel that transcribed them, but I wasn't actually appointed until January of 23. And so I hope that I had a good excuse for not being here before that. Only actually president of the March. And she said she made those changes. So
good. Any other updates or changes, recommendations?
My only comment is it's really quite a hefty number of minutes that we received. And though I did get through a chunk of it, I did not get through all of it. And I wondered about if it being appropriate to say, can we have another week? Or can we have longer to issue 3 minutes? If not, those of you who have read through it and are able to do that, I just had a few days that I was not able to go through it all.
I waded through it all, so I can go either way. So if there's enough of us that are available, so
I went through.
So any other thoughts or on passing these at this time?
Appreciate that feedback, Commissioner Barr, and we don't pile up on this thing.
And I'm fine actually for those of you in the majority, but I just wanted to be honest and upfront where I was
comment, Sean?
quickly. I was present at the March 23rd, or excuse me, March 2nd, 2023 meeting. I was excused about halfway through that meeting. So I don't know how you want to say that in the minutes, but I participated for part and then I had to leave.
Hey, having the minutes read before, are we okay with making a recommendation to approve the minutes with the noted changes that have been spoken about tonight? Would someone like to make a motion, or we can table it for a future meeting?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes as been presented and along with the comments that were made regarding the minutes.
A motion on the table, a second.
I'll second it.
Motion made by Commissioner Park, and then second by Manya. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, and so I'm thinking that it basically was 3-1 abstain at this time. Is that right? I didn't hear anything. Okay, for the record, Commissioner Parr abstained for the record. All right, administrative item number 3. Let's go ahead and we'll keep moving along for tonight.
I make a real comment just real quick.
Yes.
So what I think, you can tell me if you're okay with this for the next set of minutes, because we will have about the same amount to catch up on, probably available for this September meeting. So what I'll try to do, I'm assuming you'll be okay with this, but I'll try and maybe send those out earlier than the actual packet. So you'll have additional time, maybe like a week.
Perfect. I like that better. Yeah, because I would like to get caught up as quick as we can, because I'm getting, it's like I told you the other day, I'm getting a little absent-minded per se to go, who said this or who said that? So the quicker we can.
So this was about half of the batch, so to speak, that we needed to get caught up on. And then there were some questions on some of the others. And so I'm working through those details. We should have those done probably in the next 2 weeks. So I was trying to balance getting caught up with not overloading the commission. So
I like that idea. Pre-pack it before the official packet would help us get started. Great idea. All right, let's go ahead and move on with item number 3, the administrative items. First is A, Peak View Lot 2, a site plan approval, an amendment of Peak View Lots 3 and 4 landscaping plan at approximately 400 west and 2700 north. We'll go ahead and turn the time over to staff to review the items of a very well put together packet. And then we'll go ahead and make our discussions.
again, this is for Peakview Lot 2 site plan application. And then there's a slightly amended landscaping plan for Lot 3 and 4, which previously received approval. I believe it was in the April 20th meeting. I will note that this is an administrative item and there's a relatively narrow degree of discretion on administrative items. If they meet the requirements of the code, they are entitled to approval under that code. And then with the acceptance, just when there's questions of discretion in terms of interpreting how a code may apply to a particular situation. So this is in the C2 zone. It's located at approximately 2700 north. The applicant is proposing a building and site plan for this property. The uses that are proposed are understood by staff to fall under both the sit-down restaurant category, and then for 2 of the 3, and then for 1 use, it's interpreted to fall reasonably under neighborhood services. The 3 particular uses that are proposed are Burley Burger, Sun Asian Grill, and Menchie's. There was an adjustment to the location of Sun Asian Grill from an earlier building to be moved into this building, and so that's what's being proposed. The Menchie's is the use that is proposed to be categorized under neighborhood services. Our ordinance does state that substantially similar customarily accessory uses that are customarily accessory to a listed use or similar may be administered to a category, may be administratively allowed as determined by the community development coordinator. And so staff is of the opinion that Menchie's can be considered similar in impacts and use to say a bakery, which is one of the examples that's listed in the neighborhood services. The setback standards for this building are pretty basic. There's 20 feet for the front setback. For the side, there's also a 20-foot setback, and then for the rear, the setback there is 20 feet also, and it comes in on the front at over 45 feet away, over 34 feet on the east side, and over 24 feet on the west side, and then which are the side property lines, and then in the what's interpreted as the rear property line, it's at over 86 feet. So it's well over the setback requirements and in compliance with those. I'll just mention that there was a slight mishap with the building permit. There has been a building permit issued. It's in an early stage of progress. And so I'll address that a little bit towards the end. But staff would just recommend as an additional condition of approval based on the situation at present that there be, this isn't in the written report, but that there be a minor adjustment for the building location within the requirements of setback requirements in case there was just a slight variation in the location of the building based on what's shown in the plans or in comparison to what's shown in the plans. But again, within the requirements of city code. The height of the building is within the within the height requirement. It's been indicated to be 21 feet. And so it's well under the 65 feet or 5-story maximum. With regards to the trash enclosure, the trash enclosures and dumpsters are not located in the front or side setback. There is a masonry wall enclosure that's shown as part of the site plan, enclosing the dumpsters. And we do have there is the basic requirement that the dumpsters be enclosed with a concrete or masonry wall that architecturally relates to the primary structure. Staff recommends to fulfill that requirement that the masonry on the enclosure be a color of masonry that is used on the color of the main structure. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the main color, but like either the trim or the main color on the building, something that makes it compatible in colors is how staff would recommend that be a simple way that be fulfilled. If the commission has a different view of how it's best to fulfill that, feel free to discuss that. The next requirement is there's a 15% of the gross area is required to be attractively and permanently landscaped. As has been indicated on the prior approval for lots 3 and 4, the applicant has provided that has met that 15%. The 15% is being applied to the master development as a whole. Have been approximately 6,513 square feet above the 15% landscaping requirement. The prior lots that have been approved have been consistent with what they stated that they would approve. This lot, however, is coming in about a little under 1,300 square feet less than what they'd originally stated that it would. I believe I'm not certain about this, and the applicant can address it if they choose or if the commission would like, but I believe there was some landscaping on the east side that was removed, but they're still over by approximately.
Lot 2 still over the 50%.
Well, we've been applying the landscape as a whole to the whole site. And so the site as a whole will still be about 5,200 square feet in excess of the requirement with this adjustment. So it still has a 5,200 square foot approximate buffer of extra landscaping before it hits the 15% threshold. So
Do you want us to stop and ask questions along the way or wait till you're done?
if it helps you to clarify that you're.
Can I just clarify that one? Because I had that one highlighted, marked. I guess I kind of go back to what if the land, someone comes and asks us to subdivide. We're looking at this property as a whole and this one is now below, but as a total, it meets the requirements. Someone could come in later as they did in one of the other areas in the city and then subdivided those off and sold them off, or does that make it non-compliant then?
If they were to subdivide, they would be vesting new property rights, and so they would need to come into compliance with landscaping at that time for a new vested right. Like,
But is that a problem that we should address it as individual, or is this still as, this is one, each of those lots, are they considered 2, 3, and 4 as individual lots, or are they recorded as a combined?
currently, they're recorded as separate lots.
So then it should meet the requirement.
Well, it was determined by the commission in the last meeting, and I believe in prior discussions, that they were okay applying the 15% to the larger development as a whole.
But if they sold one of them, that could be a problem. As long as they know that and that's on the record, that could be a problem that they have to come into compliance with. Is that right?
They sold it.
If they sold off lot 2 or sold off lot 4.
Yeah.
Does that make it where the whole project is now not compatible?
Well, as long as it's still in the same subdivision, if they modify the subdivision, that's what would all do.
Yeah, and then
Subdivision itself, requirement.
we also have, I concur with Amy, and we have a requirement in our code that approvals, like conditions of approval, need to be kept in effect in order for the permits associated with that approval to continue to be valid. So if they were to change something in a way that was unauthorized, then it affects the validity of the approval that's been granted. So so to my understanding, there's, I think, 3 lots that are remaining to be developed, lots 5, 6, and 7. So we're over the halfway mark, so to speak, as far as approvals. This is the first that they've adjusted the amount of landscaping, and we're still at a little over 5,000 square feet in excess of the 15%. So I think it's a comfortable buffer to be sitting at for the site as a whole. On the next point there, the applicant does have secondary water for the site. There's a requirement of the 1 tree for every 300 square feet. The applicant has met that. 15 trees have been provided on lot 2. And I've already addressed the square footage of landscaping. Let's see. They're actually over it by a couple of trees. There's 15 and they're required to have 13. So also as part of this, the applicant made minor adjustments to the landscape plan for lots 3 and 4, which were approved in the April 20th meeting. Staff is, that was actually at the request of staff, and the same number of trees are being provided. It was a relatively minor adjustment. The adjustment is simply that staff requested a adjustment to the location of some of the trees to keep them farther away from a city water main line. It's a 14-inch main line, and so as many people know, trees like to get into water mains. So we just requested that they be moved. And so they've done that. That should have been one of the exhibits in your packet. What we are recommending is we're satisfied with the plan. We just would, as far as the tree location for both lots 3 and 4, and then also lot 2, staff is recommending that you include in your approval, if you choose to approve it, that lot 3 and 4 be part of that approval, and it just at least the landscape plan for it, actually, specifically, so that it's adjusted as a new landscape plan. But then we do have one request that they just put a dimension line showing from the top back of curb next to the drive-throughs on the buildings on lots 3 and 4 and 2. A distance to the center of the trunk of each of the trees. What that will accomplish for and that the distance be no farther than 9 feet. I measured it out, and most of them, and they meet that. They do, all the trees meet that requirement, but it helps us when we're enforcing a landscape plan or other site plan. They operate sometimes as a visual version of a contract, and so if we have that number put on the plan with the dimension line, we can go out and verify this tree is in the location that it was specified would be, so we get the distance from the water main. So staff would recommend that those distances be shown with the dimension line on the plan as specified in the written staff report, to be no farther than 9 feet back from the top back of curb. With regards to parking, there are 3 proposed uses again. The first is Burley Burger. That will occupy 3,000 square feet. That's classified under a sit-down restaurant. The parking requirement for that would be then 35 stalls. And then with Sun Asian Grill, it will occupy 1,500 square feet. That's also classified under sit-down restaurant. And that would occupy 20 stalls, or be the requirement per code. The standard requirement per code would be 20 stalls for that. And then for Menchie's, that's also coming in at 1,500 square feet of space. This is the use that staff feels comfortable classifying as neighborhood services, and that would come in at 6 spaces. I will say, I think I made a similar comment when we approved, when considered lots 3 and 4, that even though I think these qualify under sit-down restaurants, we're not talking about, say, just for example, an Olive Garden or a Texas Roadhouse or something where it's a longer wait time. You sit down, you have a wait time before you're sat, then you order, and et cetera. And so there's probably not going to be the same length of time per car in each stall. And I think that can reasonably allow for consideration of a reduction of the parking requirement. And that I'll go into that with regards to our ordinance in just a minute. So based on these above standards, there's a deficit of 36 stalls. But I tie that into my comments just about they're not your longer serve sit down restaurants. The buildings, of course, are being developed as a part of this larger development. And in the previous approval on lots 3 and 4, 44 stalls were required as part of that approval, to be part of the shared parking agreement with the Rush Fun Center. It appears that after further staff review, on my part, it's always fun to admit your mistakes in a public meeting, but there was a couple of minor miscalculations on my part that there was 9 more stalls required in my math than were actually required by the code. And so with that 36 stall deficit and then subtracting 9 from that would leave them at 27 stalls that is the actual deficit in this area. And so if you went with that 27 stalls, you just need to amend the shared parking agreement to require a total of 71 stalls be part of the shared parking agreement. Unless the applicant and the commission can agree on a lessened number, given the nature of these proposed uses. So looks like you have a question.
Question is, the agreement is really between lot 1 and lot 2, 3, 4, right? So that
Yes.
is lot 1 still considered part of this ownership group, or they're separate? So they create the lot agreement. They just need to come in and say, here's the shared parking agreement.
Yes, that's correct. It's a agreement between private parties that would need to be verified by the city as a means of enforcing the parking
So
standards.
there again, if somebody decides to purchase it, they can ask that be continued to be enforced between those landowners. That's not the city thing. That's something that's been set up between them.
That's correct. But going back to your prior question about, like keeping, changes made after the fact. This is also something where, because we're enforcing a parking requirement, the city has an interest in in ensuring that that parking agreement stays in place.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask a question relative to parking as well? I'm not aware of any well, I guess it'd be on-street parking on 2700 North or 2550 North. How about Hillsborough Drive to the east? Is there going to be any street parking there?
Not to my knowledge.
Narrow currently. I just wonder if we shouldn't have a sufficient set aside there to maybe provide some street parking eventually if we needed any. Also, what occurs between Hillsborough and the Peak development? It looks open at the moment. And maybe we can answer that during the course of the evening.
I think that, if the applicant wants to respond to that, if they're aware, then they're welcome to respond to that. I don't know of anything factual,
It's not owned by the applicant though.
I'm not certain.
Okay.
I thought it had been, but I didn't want to speak for the applicant. So
Perhaps during the course of the evening, if we could answer that. Also on the 2650 that goes through the development, it's not really shown how that will connect to Hillsborough. I assume that's been thought about as well.
it's the plat's been recorded. And so the streets have been defined for this property. That would be something that would be addressed on the property to the east when that comes into effect. But it's not something that can be considered for this application. For sure, that's fair. So just to continue with the parking, the city code does state that there's flexibility on this. It states that with regards to the number of stalls, it says listed and unlisted uses may provide alternate data from a traffic engineer or other appropriate sources which may be considered for the Planning Commission for use in a site plan. The above mentioned section of city code provides that flexibility regarding the number of stalls that may be required. One application of this would be that the required parking amount may be significantly reduced by the commission. My professional opinion is that the number of parking stalls required by the above calculation is likely a little bit excessive just because these are shorter term restaurants, like shorter stay than an Olive Garden. One option is to keep the shared parking agreement in place at the current number of the 44 stalls, or to amend it by a smaller amount than 27. But that it's your judgment and your discretion that should be making that decision at the end of the day. So staff recommends that the commission consider whether the parking agreement needs to be amended as a recommended condition of approval, and that and that also that if it is amended to accommodate additional parking for these uses, that certificates of occupancy should not be issued for the building on lot 2 as part of this site plan prior to the number of additional stalls determined to be needed for the uses in this building being completed and approved by the city as part of the Rush Fund Center or other areas on the larger site that are part of a shared parking area. Staff's requested that the applicant provide information regarding any case studies that they would like to regarding existing similar tenants and sites with similar square footages that if they'd like to show and discuss the possibility of a reduced parking requirement. The applicant did submit a couple of slides that we have on a USB drive that if they would like to discuss at the proper time, they're welcome to do so. With regards to parking stall size, the stalls do meet the required stall size. Then there's also the issue of parking lot lighting. They actually have met the requirement for the parking lot lighting being shown on their civil plans. I just wasn't certain about the use of the symbol that they were using. So that requirement has been met. And then they have shown a 2.5 foot berm along 2700 North. The requirement is for a 2.5 foot berm. I discussed that with the applicant's engineer this afternoon, and I was just a minor oversight. So, they're more than happy to add an additional 6 inches. So, The applicant should be aware that any approval is granted with conditions and it's not a carte blanche approval, and that necessary signatures, building permits, or certificates of occupancy will not be provided by the city until the conditions of approval of any site plan are granted or met. Keeping that in mind will assist the applicant towards in moving the applicant and the city towards being able to complete the building permits for the project on this site. So there's a list of 12 recommended conditions of approval. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read all of them. They are listed in the written staff report. But I will just make the point again that there was a building permit that was mistakenly issued. It's a very early level of progress. I believe I'm not certain exactly, but I believe there's footings and foundation in place. And so staff would recommend, in addition to what's in the written report, that minor adjustments to the building location within the setback requirements of city code be permitted as part of this approval and as a condition of approval. So that was a bit of a mouthful. Are there any questions that the commission has for me that I can answer?
Yeah.
Questions for staff?
I had a question on 2700 North. I'm sure that UDOT has either given approval or looking at approval for all of those entrances. Can you point out which ones are approved by UDOT?
Entrances into this site?
There,
Yeah,
looking at this, it doesn't look like it would be a typical UDOT permit, but due to distance, if people are coming in and out, they're going to potentially hit each other crossing paths, trying to turn left
yes,
it looks a little close. So if UDOT has approved it, that's not our business, but
I was not involved in that. I assumed that it was taken care of at the subdivision level. So
Can you pull the map up on it?
Yeah. It's just UDOT has been so particular over the last few years of distancing entrances and having combined entrances and exits. And yet I look at this and there seems to be a lot of entrances and exits.
But I'm not sure we're looking at the same, because this is 2700, right? So there's no access to it.
no.
The access is the road.
Okay, so I am happy to speak to this.
Okay, yeah, okay. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong.
So, I zoomed in a little too much. There we go.
Parcel, if you look at that blown up, the only entrance to 2700 is the 400 West Street.
Correct.
Oh,
And
They're going around the
Okay.
building, they're driving us around the
in
building.
working and
Yeah, 'cause I'm
coordinating
looking.
with that, I don't know if you all recall, if you look across the street at the Bailey 2700 project, we have actually arm wrestled significantly with UDOT on this issue, and are anticipating a full traffic signal to be located here. The latest that we'd heard from them is that there was approval for that. And we are looking forward to that, frankly, from a safety perspective, to have that mechanism in place. And so just with regard to the setbacks and with the way the subdivision is laid out, there was pre-approval of UDOT for the way that the access is, as well as the setbacks.
And just to point out, the commissioner asked the question, and we can ask the petitioner tonight if they're willing to give us maybe a foresight in any of these, but the way it's laid out is the connection to 2550 here, and then connection to 2700 here. And then these eventually will tie into the other parcels, and the hope is that it will cut through to the other.
Okay. Okay.
And those are private roads on the site.
The cross action, right? Okay, yes. So I think the commission and staff spent a lot of time last time when they initially laid out this, and it was a fairly decent flow for that. So appreciate that. Any other questions? Questions for the staff?
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Were you wondering if 2550 north was 2700.
That was
Yes,
based on the map that
They were looking at all of these little entrances.
we're looking at this map and it didn't really specify 2550 or 2700. So it was just, it looked very confusing for a
Very
moment.
willing.
Okay. That's great. Thank you.
So as I look at just as a reminder, as I looked at the commission, we can have a petition come up here. There's, the way I read it, we have the 12 different items, but number 4, number 5 stood out to me that we need to specifically address and decide how we're going to move forward with tonight with our recommendation. The first one being the parking, and then number 5 is we need to make sure that we spell out an update that the lots 3 and 4 and 2 for the site plan. So would we like to talk? Let's go ahead and have the petitioner come up. We can ask a few questions and then we can dive into the parking discussion. State your name and address, please, for the record.
Dave Maloli, 2273 North, 2825 West Plain City. Yeah, I'm here representing ALS Development. And I thought I would just address a couple of things earlier before you might ask me some questions, just some things that had been noted. The question on the landscaping. So we do have an owners association as well. And every lot is a part of that owners association. And as part of that says things like you can't change landscaping, you can't, there's shared parking agreement. All of that is wrapped up in the owners association. So if we were to sell a lot off, whoever buys into that lot is buying into the association. Okay. And unless they got the entire group to vote on a change of anything, nothing can change. So, if one owner came and bought it all out and then decided to change it, but they'd have to come here anyways and change all that. So that adds a little extra layer of protection as far as that goes. And then the shared parking is part of that as well. You had talked about potential parking on 2550 or 2550. So there is plenty of room for side parking. I think it's up to the city if they would allow parking on 2550 or not. So people currently park on it now, but it would really just be up to the city to allow that.
I don't think so, and it's heavily used by the apartments. That in some way.
It is a public right of way, so.
I just wonder, it's not overly wide road right now. We ought to probably protect any street parking that might be available.
That would be a really good question for our public works. And so that could be something we could absolutely work with them to address.
I do have safety issues on 2550. It's not that wide of a street. I actually grew up lived on 2550. I remember a pedestrian being killed down 2550 because it is narrow, and the more parking that we have on that street, I can see being a potential hazard. So I think we need to be really careful about assuming there can be an overflow on a street without causing issues.
Anybody?
I think Hillsborough is a private road currently, which will eventually be a city road, but that's not going to happen until the other side of it's developed. So, and I would say now, no, because there's no room. Yeah.
The space between hills and
Yep, we own that lot as well, and we have a user we should be coming in really quick for. We will, yeah. Yeah, there will be more parking, primarily to serve the user. But that spot will fill all the parking needs for that user. It wouldn't need any more. As far as the parking goes, the Rush lot, we did oversize quite a bit, anticipating all of this that would be coming. To give you an example, the Rush Funplex at Syracuse, they have 100 stalls in the front parking area, and we have 148 in our front. And then that side section you see that's along it on the 2650, there's 30 stalls there. So we have about 177 stalls just for the Rush, which is quite a bit more than they have in Syracuse. Syracuse is a 120,000 square foot building. This is a 77,000 square foot building. So a lot of this was designed to meet and take on some of that. As well, though, these are all double drive-through buildings. So we don't anticipate a whole lot of walk inside and stay, and neither do our users. I would say the Burly Burger and the Rusty Taco, which is on lot 4, Burly Burger's on lot 2, probably the heaviest sit down and eat. Everything else will more likely be pick up and go.
Even then, they don't have very many cars
Correct.
at a time.
Yep.
Not that I've been there a few times, but
I have a
So
point of clarification, Dave, and I should remember this, but I don't offhand. With the improvements with the subdivision, does that include some widening of 2550?
Yep.
That's what I recall.
2550 was
it is wide.
That section.
The-
And so
Where the apartments are down here, the road actually indents in, and that's where people park on the side. So it's a widened road. And I believe you guys have already
they've already
a
made the
curb and you've already made those improvements to the road. So it is already a wider section
roads develop along those improvements.
than we were required also. Yeah, that was one of our site plan discussions when we created this.
Do you anticipate 2550 to get more busy with the improvements down on 89 or?
Possibly if more UDOT wrangling, but
Yeah.
if we can get a signal in where we'd like it.
Gotcha.
So I have a question on the parking as far as, I appreciate that you have the extra 30 here. And I think that was part of our discussion when we said that there was going to be an agreement between these lots for the parking. Are you have any reservation with amending that parking agreement between them just to include X amount more? You're
No.
talking that it's a general ownership one and that's what the group decided was to recommend a updated parking.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we can figure out the best way to do it because it's these uses that are currently there, obviously not always going to be there. Eventually, some are going to go out of business and move. So I don't know if the number is the right way to do it or to say that adequate parking will be provided, throughout the entire project or something like that. But as of right now, the current bylaws of the owners association state that it's shared parking. So
I'm with you and I think I stated this last time this came forth was, if I'm going to sublease, I want to make sure I have enough property for
Yep.
parking.
correct.
And if not, then I wouldn't sublease it if I didn't think my tenants
Yeah.
have enough.
And ultimately the tenants are the ones that can inspect that or not, right? They'll come in and say, well, I don't think you're good. I won't come here.
So I wouldn't come and then you as a developer, or the owners are not going to want to not have adequate
Right.
parking or they'll have a harder time for the next sublease.
Yep.
Other questions for the petitioner?
And a lot of these uses won't necessarily hit at the same time. The Rush parking lot will be largely dead until the evening, especially during the school year. So there's more than adequate parking for lunch and everything for all the uses up top. And, like the soda place is probably going to be really heavy in the morning and maybe in the evening, but maybe not so much at lunch. I think we've studied it pretty well and our tenants are all completely on board with how it's set up. So we'll see when it actually gets out there, but
Petitioner would like to present or need to present?
there was just one other thing about the cross access. So we did have to sign an agreement with UDOT that said that we would provide cross access easement agreement. So we have to technically connect to both sides, which is why we stubbed it the way that we did. So, but we do plan to continue 2650 to Hillsborough when we come in for the next lot there.
This way, and that prevents them from adding another entranceway, so that's good.
Yep.
The road is on our master plan, it's on a pretty road. The current, is not considered better than the e-bike a little bit, but I actually think the portion of it, I can't remember.
I think Jim did some,
They'll straighten it out.
I think it still stays curvy, but it adds like 4 or 5 feet.
Yeah, it's been about 4 feet of these.
Yeah.
About a 60,
It'd be a 60-foot right away.
Yeah, that's kind of weird because one side is, it's not uniform with that clear spans.
What do you mean by that? Like one side is wider than the other for like a bike path, or is that what you're
It
saying?
widens as it goes to 25,
Oh,
50,
okay.
and 2700, but the middle stayed skinny for some
Okay,
reason.
I see what you're saying.
very awkward road. All right, let's make sure that we keep this back on the lots. We appreciate you sharing some future site for us. Let's go ahead. This does not require a public hearing, is that right? Okay, that's what I thought. Let's go ahead and discuss among commissioners. Is there any specifics that we would like to add, subtract, thoughts on the parking?
I think because of the extra parking available at Funplex, I can be comfortable with that. If it wasn't for that, I'd have a hard time being on board. But that extra parking, I think, does make up for that. I can see people going to the Funplex and then probably walking then over to get something to eat or back and forth. The other thing is these type of restaurants are, people look, if there is no parking, they just go elsewhere. I mean, in large part, you look at it and all the time, I'm like, oh, Chick-fil-A? No, I'm not going to hit that. I'll go to Wendy's instead. But I think, yeah.
You, based on your comments for the parking and the shared parking, would you recommend an updated parking agreement between the lots? Or are you comfortable with it is?
Well, it
And at
sounds
what
like-
number?
It sounds like they've got a development agreement in place, a parking agreement
And there's.
of shared parking. Yeah, it sounds like they've already got that agreement, or did I misunderstand that? Yeah.
The impression I got.
Any other questions, Don?
So could I have for one clarification there? The requirement for the last approval is that there be a shared parking agreement, but with the requirement, they were required only to share 44 stalls. So it is correct that there's an agreement in place. Pertinent question may be, should that number be increased?
Adjusted.
Or should it, or is it permissible for it to stay the same?
Should look at changing that.
It would be for the commission to debate.
So, and maybe this is a question for the applicant. Is it okay if we bring him back
Yes.
up? Do you see any issue adding 27 stalls to the parking agreement that's in place right now between the HOA?
No, like I said, the only reason I would have hesitation is just if some of these users left. You know, so I guess my question is, when a future use comes and say it's a different use, maybe it's less, you know, how is that going to be recaptured to here at the city and then also to be changed at in the bylaws of our owners association? That's the only question I have. There's definitely no issue with us putting it into the association now saying, you know, each lot has to share a certain percentage of parking or something like that. It seems to me if there was a specific number in the future, it could just be either lost here or something like that.
We don't control the HOA. They could change the number in the document anyway without us knowing. So,
but maybe just in the initial, there's no problem with this.
And in reality, I mean, is there going to be an attendant out there marking down where the people are walking after they
To
park
me, I
their
think the
car.
bigger question, and maybe just my recommendation would be to look at the ordinance and say, should there be a lesser parking amount for uses like this? I think Brandon alluded to that a little bit, where these aren't, straight up sit down restaurants. Could there be, okay, Menchie's and Burley Burger and Rusty Taco? They're not sit downs, they're fast casual. So can fast casual be 5, stalls per 1,000 or whatever the number is? That's one thought I have.
But if somebody else moves in that needs more,
Correct.
then we're in trouble and we don't have control over it. So that's why if the agreement's already in place and you say someone moves out and there's a less, it doesn't matter because the agreement's still.
But
At his point, no one's watching. Did they go to Fun Center? Or did they go to?
yeah,
Right?
I think what, to your point is, you're approving it based on the use, because we can, and Brandon and I have had this conversation, we could put a spec building up, right? And we could say, well, we project these uses to come in. And I would think you would say, well, okay, according to the building that you put up and the parking that you have, these are all the uses you have available. So, in the future, how is the city going to know that the parking is shared? Is there a document, or it's not recorded, right? Is there an
So, I mean,
agreement that
it
could
goes
be
back to the
recorded?
point of like, the city should see a copy of the shared parking agreement.
The bylaws, which
Right.
was submitted when we did the subdivision. The bylaws were,
Okay, so, but
yeah,
Yeah,
we just
so they
updated it.
needs to be updated already for lots 3 and 4, and then this would be. I mean, hopefully you can I don't think that we've seen it for lot 3 and 4 yet, because it's supposed to be in place prior to the certificates of occupancy being issued for lots 3 and 4. But instead of amending it to 44, if the number's recommended to be changed by the commission, then we can just update it to a new number.
Okay.
So, and then we'd see it that once, and then the
Yeah.
follow-up would be that it's a condition of approval that stay in place, for the approval to stay in place. I think the only way that it would become a functional issue is if there's parking issues on the site at some point that are causing problems for the city, which we could revisit it at that time. But the city would have a copy of the document, that's, and say you agreed to this, we're having problems. So
I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but all these tenants still have to come in for a business license, right?
Correct.
Do they go to planning commission that just handle the staff?
So this is kind of the city, like, this perspective, last shake at this.
Yeah.
The building permit, we go, and
Mhm.
it's there, as long as it fits, appropriately.
Yeah. Sure. And in the future, just, are there any parking uses that are more intense than restaurant, or is that like the heaviest amount of parking needs?
it's probably the heaviest.
Maybe in the C2 zone, at least the heaviest. So anyways, that was the only, so technically we're approving it on the worst case scenario right now. So
If you were to change out a use in one of the buildings, then it would be like if there's any type of modifications to the building, it's called a TI, but you'd come
Yeah.
back through, and then there's some evaluation there. But the ultimate goal with the process right now is just to make sure, mapping out, we've got all these awesome new buildings coming in. We're so excited. But to map out and ensure that there's adequacy of parking as a holistic thing.
Yeah.
We have to evaluate each of the individual uses to
Sure.
try to map that out. And so it's just trying to maximize that, I think.
So in the future, when another tenant comes and say
That is already,
will you guys address parking at that point when they go for their permit probably, or their business license?
not at business license,
TI, I
the
guess.
parking, yeah, the TI, if there's modifications to the building that are taking place, that's kind
Gotcha.
of where that would come into play. And I mean, to your point, and I haven't verified the code, Brandon would know better than I, but I would say that the requirement for restaurants is probably one of the higher ones. So
Okay.
I think based on the type of this development, I don't anticipate new and additional parking needs
Yeah.
later, but part of it too is that there are.
Sure. Which would have been nice had we just had everything approved at the PUD level, right? Had all like the buildings Because then we could have addressed parking on a global basis at that one time, right? Now we're kind of like retrofitting it.
We do like the shared parking as much as possible.
Yeah.
You know, when things can't overlap. We've encouraged that. We don't want just a city full of asphalt parking lots.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yep.
anywhere we do shared, so the shared agreement is actually looking
Yeah.
at a good opportunity.
Yeah, so as far as that, I think a number's fine. I don't,
Very beneficial to future tenants as well. We can think about that.
yeah,
Okay, any other questions for the petitioner while we have them up again? Okay, thank you.
yep.
Any other discussion items? So from the parking standpoint, I'm taking that people are very comfortable with the shared, but we would like to update it. Is there a updated number? Do we want to go all the way to 71? Do we want to split the difference? What are we feeling that we would need to, it doesn't sound like from the applicant that he's open to that. I think whether it's shared, people are going to park anyway, wherever they go, but it does help us make sure that we're covering for those tenants and for the future parking.
It also makes it so that when the next person comes in, they're not saying, well, you did this for that party, so why won't you make an adjustment here? So if we stick with what the requirement is and just update the shared parking.
Brandon, you had a comment that perhaps the number could be reduced in that.
I think so, based on the description. Drawings. I definitely take that mention that requires. I think there is an answer to your question, Commissioner Farr, and I think the answer is why did, if the commission moved in this direction, why did they do so? And I think the answer is because the nature of the uses that are being approved as part of and the plan that's being approved for those uses is that those uses are lower than the typical sit-down restaurant. So there's a substantive answer, not just like one based on favoritism or something.
But the concern is what something is now, what it necessarily is going to be in 5 years or 10 years. And we are seeing so much growth in this area and so much traffic in this area that I don't know, how do we assure that one of these doesn't leave and then somebody comes in who does require a lot more parking?
If there's no other discussion, do we have someone who'd like to make a motion reminding that we have to stipulate the parking agreement, or if there's any adjustments, what numbers? And then on item number 5, that we provide approval for the update. I guess that's just spelling out all items 1 through 12. And then Brandon, you also mentioned that we need to approve a minor adjustment to the setbacks for lot 2. Is that correct?
Just a small amount of flexibility, minor adjustments to the building location within the requirements of city code, just to accommodate the fact that there's been footing and foundation support.
What did you recommend, Brandon, for the shared agreement? 71, was it?
71 is what the code specifies, but it leaves the commission flexibility to adjust that number. So 71 for the shared parking agreement.
I'm comfortable with that, considering there's very little street parking available.
I'd be comfortable with 60. Split it a little bit.
I'm fine with making 71 works because it doesn't matter who the tenant is, but 60 works fine with me. That's why I say I would not go any lower than that. I thought split it.
Yeah, either way.
Because the people are still going to park everywhere. It's more of making sure there's adequate for whoever comes in for the future. I think it's more of the future thing is what we're setting. Shouldn't that be petitioner driven, really? I can't see any reason to arbitrarily change it without a request from the petitioner. It asked us, but not formally. I mean, it's been verbally, but if it were really that big of an issue for them, I think they would make a formal petition for that. I can't see changing the ordinance haphazardly.
I think my only reason for even considering it is the recommendation from Brandon that perhaps the parking is too much in this case. And I tend to agree with that. I think we typically do put more parking requirements than are really necessary in a lot of uses. And sometimes that's not the case, but in this case, with the parking that's available with the Rush Fund Center, different times of the day when people actually use those facilities, the drive-throughs, I just think we could reduce that number.
If we were going to do that, shouldn't we come up with a halfway restaurant drive-through, call it something? It just seems like if you're going to make a change in the ordinance, you ought to make a thought-out ordinance, thought-out change rather than a haphazard change.
But the ordinance gives us that discretion. So it anticipates that we may see something different. So we're not changing an ordinance, we're actually following the ordinance. But if we feel like based on what has been reviewed and recommended, a change is necessary, then we have the authority to do that.
Julie, that you never know 2-3 years from now what restaurant's going to be there. You could end up with another Chili's in your lease parking lot that has 0 parking.
Well, but Chili's wouldn't fit into these square.
But I'm just saying, we don't know what'll be there down the road.
But if they come in and modify the building, then they, like Amy's saying, they'd have to come in and represent.
Yeah, regardless, I'm so sorry. I think we're limited by the square footage of the building. Depending on what comes in there, staff will classify it as a certain type of building. So they said Menchie's is something different than the 2 restaurants. But if another restaurant comes in, it's going to be that same requirement. So
That's why I say it should stay the same. It should stay as per code currently, rather than changing it without an official petition.
Any other points of discussion, or would someone like to make a motion this time?
Fun, I've done it before. I'd like to make a motion that we approve the site plan as presented with consideration for the 12 advisements of the planner, particularly the shared parking agreement being moved to 71 places. And anything on the landscaping that needed to be specifically addressed?
Helps out with the wording, Brandon, because
I think the motion includes the approval of the updated landscaping plan for lots 3 and 4 based on the way it was stated, because you referenced the 12 conditions.
12 items.
One point is, would you like to include in the motion or not the 13th recommendation that I made about minor adjustments to the building location within the setback requirements of city code?
Footings are in, so we probably should. Yes, approving the footings as currently placed.
Okay, we have a motion on the table to approve the Peakview Lot 2 site plan application and amendment landscaping plans for lots 3 and 4 with the staff recommendations for all 12 plus the added 13 for the minor adjustments for the setback improvements as noted by staff. Do we have a second for the motion on the table?
71.
And the 71 parking stall parking agreement to be modified and updated. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
We have a second. Discussion about the motion on the table. Okay, hearing no discussion, we'll vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you very much for that. And thank you from the petitioner for coming tonight and presenting that. Now that the vote's been made, can we get an update on do you anticipate anybody else that you can share with us at this time in any of those other building spots? No, just give us who you're willing to share with. You don't have to share, but if you're willing to, it's always fun to hear what's coming into the city.
So going from lot 4 to lot 2, It goes Soda Mix, Marco's Pizza, Rusty Taco, Roxbury, Orange Theory Fitness, The Bird, and then the three we talked about, or Sun, Menchie's, and The Bird, or Bird.
That's your own food court. That sounds
I know.
like just.
Yeah, if we
Sounds like
needed
an
it, much
exciting
needed.
place, yes.
Yep. Yep, we do have a few more starting to fill up on the west side, and then we have a tire shop that we're going to come talk to you about on the new lot. So,
Great. Appreciate you coming on
Yeah.
and sharing that.
thank you.
It's exciting for us. Let's go ahead. We'll move on to item number 4, our land use training. We're excited to have a special guest come and share his time with us tonight. We'll turn the time over to Brandon and actually have him do the introduction for us.
So we're excited to have Will Summercorn here tonight. I have tremendous respect for Wilf. He's a great voice of moderation and thoroughness in the state. He's a real resource in the land use arena. He has operated as the legislative chair for APA Utah, and then he also serves with the Utah Land Use Institute currently. He's professionally retired from in a full-time capacity, although it seems like he still operates full-time in a lot of ways, just in a lot of ways on a volunteer basis. But he previously served as the director of regional planning and transportation for Salt Lake County, as well as the planning director for Salt Lake City, and the director of community economic development for Davis County, as well as community development director for Centerville City. Wilf maintains a land use blog that's very helpful if you're trying to stay up to date on land use goings on in the state and in the nation. I'm always amazed at his ability to track down articles about land use in the news, whether it's state or national. They're very helpful to planners to stay abreast of trends and activities that are going on. So if you are not subscribed to that, I can try and send you a link to that. I follow it and try to pass on articles when I can to others. And then the presentation he's going to give tonight relates to group dynamics and group decision making. And we heard from Craig Call back in late June, and Craig's training is very technical and very legal about these are the parameters in which the Planning Commission operates. I feel like this is that's sort of a lot of the hard information, and this is a really great counterbalance to that, because it's a lot of soft skills about how to manage group dynamics and make good decisions where everybody's voice is heard and taken into consideration, and no one feels like they're pressured into a decision that they don't personally agree with, or things like that, how to manage things like that. So I'll turn the time over to Wilf, and Wilf has stated that he's very welcoming of questions. We are doing this to meet our state training requirements, which have been imposed by the state last couple of years. And so he'd love to hear questions from you, and he can specify.
Gifted.
Yeah, I love the discussion.
So, and he can let you know if he wants the questions either during the presentation or to hold them towards after, how you want to handle that.
So now let's talk while we're doing it. So, well, appreciate being here. As Brandon already mentioned, and by the way, you got a good one here. Brandon's a great planner. And you didn't go very far from North Ogden to here, did you? When you kind of flipped over. As Brandon mentioned, I've been kind of doing this for a long time. I've been the legislative chair for the Utah chapter of the American Planning Association since the 1990s. You may all be aware that the state code is called the Land Use Development and Management Act, LUDMA, or LUDMA as many of us call it. I actually helped write that back in the 1990s. The sponsors at that time in the House were Representative Ralph Becker, who later became mayor of Salt Lake City, and then Lane Beatty, who later became president of the Senate. So we had some pretty influential people that were involved in that. And I've been doing this forever. I retired a few years ago, have been working with the Utah Land Use Institute with Craig Call for some time. And as we continued to do stuff, and my wife, who also retired the same year I did, she taught high school math, everybody's favorite subject. But she says, as I keep doing stuff, she says, I thought you retired. And I said, well, yeah, I did. And I'm not working as much as I was. And she goes, yeah, but I want to go someplace. And you tell me you've got meetings and conferences to go to. So I get a little bit of that. But otherwise, let's talk as we do this. Most of the time, and it sounds like you had Craig Call here in June. And most of the time when we do these kinds of discussions, we're usually talking about the details of the law or of the code or of how things are done with planning and so on. One thing I noticed after I had been doing this for a number of years was I really got interested in trying to discover or trying to figure out why in the world did the Planning Commission or the council make the decisions that they made sometimes? Because I found myself thinking, well, this is how the decision ought to go, and they went a completely different direction. And I'm thinking, how did that happen? You know, what in the world drives? And as you watch a group, especially as you work with them over a few years, and as you watch a group or various groups interact and as they make decisions, you start picking up on stuff and you start thinking, wow, this is really some interesting dynamics going on here. So I actually dove into things a little bit. And Brandon, how do we change the slides? Do I need to tell you to flip the next slide? So I did a bunch of research and really found some good information. And so I have to give thanks to the authors of these 3 books, because most of the information that I've got in this presentation comes from these 3 books. And they are very good books. If you find yourself being interested in this kind of stuff, after we discuss it today, I would recommend any one of those books because they really have some very interesting stuff in them and serve as a basis for a lot of the stuff I'm going to tell you about here tonight. And then we'll see how that applies. So, okay, let's start out way back in 1906. We're going to go back a ways. It's the fall of 1906. And Francis Galton, 85-year-old guy, he's already established his reputation at this period of time for his work in statistics and the science of heredity and how characteristics get passed on, and the statistics of all of that was pretty notable and had really was well known. He had an idea in this fall of 1906. He headed for a country fair near where he lived in Plymouth, England. And, oops, did we lose a slide?
Yes, I didn't mean to. I paused the screen share.
We'll let you get that back. Electronics are always so fun. There we go.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Maybe for YouTube audience. You know what? Thank you. So, at least broken talking for a minute.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That'll work. Okay, there we go. All right. So anyway, Francis Galton was heading for a country fair near where he lived in Plymouth, England. He had a particular idea in mind that he was going to test. Dalton believed that democracy was a sham. And when I say he thought it was a sham, Dalton thought that the average voter, or the average person in a democracy, was capable of very little because they didn't have a lot of knowledge about the issues, about the things that maybe were being dealt with in a democracy. And so he was going to prove it, or he was going to test out his theory, and he figured he was going to prove it by doing something in particular at a country fair. You can go to the next slide. Every country fair in England at this time, pretty much all of them, they had these contests that would go. And basically what it was like this. They would have an ox, usually an oxen, maybe a cow or some other livestock. They would have that there. And then people could buy a ticket for 6 pence, and they could write down their guess of the weight of that particular ox or that livestock or whatever. And then they would deposit that in a box. And then at the end, they would go through all of the tickets, so the stubs that had been bought, and whoever was closest to the actual weight, or those who were closest, would win prizes and be able to, benefit to some extent from what they were doing. And Dalton figured that most of the people that were entering these contests didn't know much about livestock at all. So he figured they were going to be wildly wrong and things were not going to be good. In that particular day in Plymouth, when he went, there were about 800 people that bought tickets and entered their guesses in the contest. That included some farmers, some butchers. Those would be people that you figure may know something about livestock and maybe would get closer to the actual weight. But there were a few of those, not a lot of those. And Dalton figured that he would show by this with the tickets that the crowd really didn't know what they were talking about and therefore were wildly off. So he had already arranged this with the organizers after everything was done. He got all the tickets. And he then did a number of statistical tests on the tickets to show how far off things were. And he figured by showing this, he showed people don't know what they're talking about. They're so wildly off. How can you ever come to any good decision this way? The range of guesses for that day was quite broad. A lot of guesses, and it was all over the place. Of course, as I mentioned already, it mixed in a few smart people with a lot of people that really didn't know a lot about livestock. So, he pretty well figured this couldn't turn out well. But he got a big surprise. The weight of that actual ox at that fair that day was 1,198 pounds. When he averaged the guesses from all of the tickets, the weight came out at 1,197 pounds. It was off by 1 pound. Now he figured this is a fluke. And he'd already been planning this, but he went around to country fairs all over England and repeated this. And the results came out virtually the same every time. When you took the overall from all of those people that were involved in that, they came remarkably close to the actual weight of the ox when you averaged everything out. Go to another example. I should have had that slide up anyway about the wisdom of cows, but go to the next one. We'll take this one. This is from Len Fisher's book, The Perfect Swarm. And he took a jar of jelly beans like this and went into pubs around England and asked people in the pubs to guess how many jelly beans he had in the jar. And then he would write that down. He would record that. And in this particular jar of jelly beans that he had, the range that he got in all of the times that he tried this went from 41 to 93. So fairly broad range. The average of all of the guesses was 60. The actual number of jelly beans in the jar was 61. So again, very close. Another example, Columbia Business School. Every year, a certain professor there would have the students in his class write down their guesses who the winners would be for the Academy Award in 12 different categories: Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Picture, all of the various categories that they had. The best any individual student did in this guy's class got 5 of them right. The class overall, when you put together all of their guesses and averaged them out, they got 11 out of 12 right almost every year. And so research shows That the one book calls this the wisdom of crowds, right? And the research shows that this is a pretty typical phenomenon as long as there are three conditions that are met. And we'll talk about those three conditions. Before we do that, I have to say, I put this presentation together years ago. I've had this around for a while. And do I dare say this to all of you? My confidence in the wisdom of crowds, given our political situation, has kind of gone down in the last few years. So I don't know, if this really holds. But at the time, the research kind of does show this. But there are three particular conditions that if they're held to, then this wisdom of crowds kind of thing actually seems to hold true pretty well. Next slide. First one is diversity. Numerous studies, and as I mentioned, many of these studies are referenced in the books that I showed you at the beginning, show that having a wide diversity of people in a group makes the group smarter. They're more likely to come up with the right or a good answer rather than groups that are not very diverse. Uniform groups generally do not, because the rationale seems to be this: people that are pretty much alike tend to think alike, and you don't get a broad range of possibilities. And if they're right, that's great, then they're right. But if they're not right, they're not going to be right. But if you have a broader range, you have a better chance, a better tendency of getting something that's going to be in the middle there, or in a place where you probably get a better answer. In Galton's experiment there, that we talked about with the country fairs, there were some so-called experts, butchers and farmers. But when you looked at the butchers and the farmers and their guesses particularly, they didn't really do that much better than the group as a whole, which is kind of interesting. But we'll talk about that a little bit more, about this idea of experts, having experts as a group, or maybe doing something. All right, the next one. Oops, back up, there we go. The next factor of the three that need to be really kind of held to is that individuals have to make their conclusions independently. That is, it has to be their idea, not the idea of the group. And then you aggregate those individual thoughts, opinions, guesses, whatever it is you're doing. And that gives you a good result when you aggregate those individual thoughts. At those English country fairs, generally what people would do is they buy a ticket. They'd write down their thought of what it was and drop it in the box. Usually most of them didn't wind up discussing it with anybody or really getting anybody else's thoughts on it. It was their idea. And so that really kind of seems to be one of the factors. It has to be independent conclusions. And then the third one is how you aggregate those individual choices, how you actually put those together. It turns out that anonymous works the best. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But that's really, and you may be able to think about why that might be the case. But that's how you do that, how you express that choice, how you express that judgment matters in determining the outcome. Again, at those English country fairs, people wrote down their guess, they dropped it in the box. Nobody knew what their guess was, right? Nobody else really knew, because they did it on their own and did it individually and then just dropped it in the box. Okay. Now, these conditions and this wisdom of crowds idea really applies to big groups. Like in the English country fair there were like 800 people that were participating in this. And a lot of the other types of things that are looked at were large groups of people. Well, you're a planning commission, right? How many people have you got on your planning commission? 7? Councils are usually about that size as well. They're much smaller groups. So you have a much more limited range of opinions, of thoughts, because you have a much smaller group. Do these principles hold for smaller groups as well as they do for larger groups? It turns out, yes, mostly. But we have to be aware of some things because of the dynamics of what goes on in smaller groups that's different than bigger groups. And so because, as we talked about this, and as I brought this out forward with planning commissions, with councils, they're smaller groups. So we want to talk about how that works in those smaller groups. And so we'll talk about it, how that might work. So next slide. Let's talk about it. First of all, let's talk about the diversity thing. Diversity of background, of age, of experience. It's important in small groups as well. In fact, some would even say it may be even more important there. Numerous studies have shown that groups made up of diverse members do better than groups that are made up of people that have a lot of uniform characteristics, that they may be very much the same. One of the good examples given in one of the books was there was a problem-solving exercise, and people were brought in and they were asked to solve the problem, this particular problem. I don't know if it was a math problem or a logic problem, something. They might have done a variety of things, but people were asked to solve the problem, and then they would see how well they did. Then they took those individuals and put them into groups, and they varied the groups. Some groups had everybody in it was a good problem solver. They all did well. Some of the groups, nobody was very good at solving those problems. And some of the groups had some good problem solvers and some not so good problem solvers. Which one of those groups do you think did the best when they worked on those problems as a group? You would think the one that had all the good problem solvers would do the best. Wasn't the case. The groups that did the best were the ones that had a mix of good problem solvers and not good problem solvers. And you find yourself thinking, now, why would that be? And really what it kind of seems to be is that those that were good problem solvers were maybe good at a particular kind of problem, but maybe not so good at a different kind of problem, or something that had a little bit of a difference to it because they all thought alike. And when you had some people that were not good at certain problems or whatever, the mix seemed to make a difference. In other words, some people brought things to the table that others didn't have. They weren't all thinking the same way. And it maybe opened up possibilities a little bit more. Intelligence or the being good at something was not irrelevant. The groups that did the best had at least some people in them that were good problem solvers. But the groups that were all good problem solvers did not do the best. It was the mixed groups that did the best. So kind of an interesting deal to take a look at that. And that kind of raises the question, if you go to the next slide. So, why don't we fill our decision-making bodies and boards with experts? Shouldn't the planning commission be made up of everybody who knows something about this stuff? Shouldn't we have planners and land use attorneys and developers and people like that? Shouldn't that be who makes up our planning commissions? Because they're experts. They know this stuff. They deal in it all the time. What this really argues for, one of the books talks about this whole Wisdom of Crowds. The book Wisdom of Crowds actually has a whole section in it on the efficacy and the relevance of experts. And they have a lot of statistical information that really shows that for almost anything you can think of, experts in a certain area are somewhat better than people as a whole to a relatively low threshold level. They know more than most people do on average, and they'll do a little bit better. But once you start getting beyond that or doing a little bit more, they really aren't that much better than the public as a whole, which is really interesting. It really makes you say, oh, what do we have experts for? But it's an interesting thing to look at. But really what that argues for is that's not the way that we should create our bodies. They should have a mix of people. They should have, yeah, sure. I mean, have a land use attorney on there. have maybe a developer on there, but also, you know, put on somebody on there who is, you know, an accountant somewhere, or is a soccer mom, or is, you know, whatever. Broad diversity of backgrounds really seems to be the best way to go. And that way you're really going to get much better background of what your community is like. And if you're dealing with things like your general plan for your community, you want to know, you want to have the background of people in your community and what they think, not just what the experts think, the so-called experts. So that whole diversity thing is really, really an important one. Think about, you know, just to give you an idea or a kind of a thought. Y'all remember that show, that game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Y'all remember that one? And remember, when people got stuck, they could have a choice of what they could do. They could ask the audience for help. They could call an expert, or they could have something eliminated. The difference between the audience and calling a friend who they thought might know the answer. When they called the friend, overall the show, they got the right answer 60% of the time. When the audience was asked to weigh in on what the right answer was, the audience got the right answer 90% of the time. Kind of interesting stuff, you know? You think there's got to be something to this. Kind of makes it an interesting deal. Next slide. I throw this up there because y'all remember NASA, right? And the whole race to the moon, the space race and going everything. You look at these guys, do they look diverse? Man, not at all. They're all wearing white shirts. They're all wearing the pencil thin ties, you know, which was the style back in the 60s and so on. And I mean, they all have the same haircut. Do you see very many ladies in there? You know, I mean, they're not a very diverse group. And yet they were phenomenally successful. They got from basically nothing to landing 3 men or 2 men on the moon in about 9 years. Can you imagine accomplishing that today? It doesn't seem like we can do anything in 9 years or whatever anymore. Why were they so successful when they seem to be not diverse at all? The reality is they were actually a very diverse group. They're engineers. Most of them are engineers. But at that period of time, they really didn't have what you would call the aeronautical engineers or really the space engineers. That was a field that didn't exist at the time. These guys were mechanical engineers, civil engineers, electrical engineers, mining engineers. You had a whole variety of backgrounds of engineering that made up this group. They were actually quite diverse when you looked at their backgrounds. And the arguments are made that that was probably one of the reasons for their success. Here's a group of NASA engineers today. Or actually, this would be about the time when we had the shuttle disaster. They look a whole lot more diverse, don't they? I mean, you got everything in there, and they don't look alike at all. One of the books really covers the shuttle disaster, I believe, the first shuttle disaster, and what happened there. And they go through a lot of information. I mean, it's really, there was actually a commission that was looking at all of this. And one of the conclusions that they came to was one of the main reasons why the shuttle disaster happened was because this group of engineers pretty much thought the same, all of them. Pretty much thought the same way. Why? Well, by this time, you had about 4 or 5 engineering schools that were doing the aeronautical engineering. That a lot of people who were going into the space program, if you wanted to go into the space program, you had to go to one of these engineering programs. They all went to that program. That means they all wound up pretty much thinking the same way. And the book does a really good job of documenting this and showing that and what this commission came up with. They couldn't see, they weren't able to see some of the dangers that ultimately led to the shuttle disaster. Some of them maybe did see it, but they weren't about to speak up about it because it was contrary to what everybody else was thinking. And so they pretty much stayed quiet about it. And it was really that uniformity of thinking that helped lead to the shuttle disaster. In fact, they even argue in the book it was the primary cause of the shuttle disaster. So again, it argues for that whole idea of diversity. So bottom line, what that really means is for your planning commission, it's a little harder when you're thinking about your council because those guys get elected, right? But get a variety of backgrounds, get a variety of people. Not everybody, that's just in the land use or thinking the same way. Get people that are really different. And you'll probably wind up making some better decisions and having some better information and input. All right. You're in your planning commission meeting. It's getting to be 11 o'clock at night. Everybody's ready to go home. You got one last item you're dealing with. Everybody's like, let's just get this thing approved and get out of here. Everybody's ready to do it. And then one of the commissioners goes, yeah, but I got something different. Everybody groans. Oh, man. And dissent play a useful role other than tick everybody else off, when you're all ready to move and do something. But is dissent valuable? Can it play a good role? The answer, of course, is yes, it can. There are a variety of reasons for that. One of the reasons why, if somebody has a differing opinion and dissents, or maybe what the group is saying is, there may be others in the group that are thinking along those lines as well, but they don't want to say anything. And they're just kind of like, I'm not going to buck the trend. I'm just going to say it. But if somebody speaks up and says, something about this, I think differently about this, it maybe helps others go, yeah, you know what, I do too. I kind of have a different idea, but I didn't want to say anything about it. And so now maybe you start getting that out. A dissenter may bring forward information that the rest of the group doesn't have. That's that diversity thing, that really goes into that. Somebody with a different background, somebody with different experience may have some information that the rest of the group doesn't have. And now you're like going, oh, yeah, wow. If I think about that maybe that changes my mind on something. And if nothing else, it may cause the majority of the group, the members who are in the majority, to go, okay, well, he or she thinks that, and I think this. Why do I think that? Could it be that they're right and I'm wrong? And you'd maybe look at your thoughts, your ideas a little bit more closely. And you may still come to the conclusion and say, no, I think I'm right. But at least it causes you to look at it a little bit more closely and examine it and think about it and maybe make some changes. Again, an interesting study. Back in the 60s and 70s, there used to be this trend that people would get together and they would form what they called an investment club, right? These people would get together, they'd pool their money, and they'd invest it in the stock market. And they, as a group, they would decide what stocks to invest in. Some of the groups were very, very collegial, yeah, that's great, whatever, well, yeah, if you think that, let's just put our money in that. Other groups were much more argumentative, really challenged each other more. Why do you want to put stocks in that group? Or in that? Why do you want to put money into those stocks? Why do you want to do that? And they would argue back and forth a little bit more. Once again, I'm probably asking you the obvious question, but which groups do you think did better in those investments? It was the argumentative groups. It was the groups that challenged each other rather than those that just kind of went along. And The information's all there, the documentation. Dissent in and of itself is not necessarily a virtue, but neither is compliance and complacency. So you have to look at what it brings and maybe what it can create. Now, when we talk about dissent, this is not what you want, right? You guys have all probably seen this guy, right? He's the guy who doesn't agree anything, ever. And he argues about it. And he actually gets downright nasty about it sometimes, right? Now, he may be on your body. He may be somebody who comes to your meetings a lot and you hear from him all the time. What happens with a guy like that? What's your attitude to somebody that's like this guy?
I turn him off.
Yeah, you do, right? Because he's always against everything. And he can be rude about it. And, you're just like, oh man, I've had it with you. Just shut up. Now, the interesting thing is sometimes a contrarian raises good points, but because of the way he acts, you don't listen to him anymore. So that's not the way to dissent, right? It's really not the way to go. It's not productive. It's not helpful. The main concern that he seems to have is getting his way rather than trying to make a better decision with the group overall. And so that's not the way we want to talk about dissent. Dissent is usually much more respectful and more persuasive. Next slide. Any of you seen the movie or the play 12 Angry Men? Henry Fonda was the character in the movie. I've seen the play a couple of times. The play is as good as, in some ways, even better than the movie. But the interesting part of this is you have a group, you have a jury, young guy who's on trial for murder, for killing somebody. But there were some circumstances around it. But most of the people that are on this jury, they either are already convinced because of various prejudices that they have, various thoughts that they have, that this guy's guilty. Or they're just like, I don't care, I just want to get out of here. One of them wants to get to a baseball game. So he's like, let's just hurry up and decide this guy's guilty so we can get out of here. But you have one guy in the jury who's much more like, oh, no, let's look at this more closely. And, I don't know how realistic the movie and the play really is, but by his gentle persuasion, by his discussing, by his being respectful, but getting other people to think a little bit, by the end of the movie, at the end of the play, he's pretty well turned everybody in the jury around. Like I say, I don't know how realistic that is, but because my wife and I just finished watching this show about Emmett Till. You're all familiar with that. It's called Women of the Movement. And the jury there that was going to not convict the two guys that actually later admitted to killing Emmett Till. But on the jury, you've got a couple of people that are kind of hanging out, holding out. They're saying, yeah, but, and these other people are just browbeating. So I don't know how realistic this is. But really what it boils down to is that there are plenty of studies that show that even a single dissenter in a group can make a difference in the ultimate outcome or decision of the group. And that's maybe worth, having somebody there that has a bit of a different idea. I can give you an example. This was when I was at Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City's ordinance allowed for some variation in the right-of-way width on a cul-de-sac, for whatever reasons. And we had a developer that was proposing putting in a fairly short cul-de-sac, but because of the size and the characteristics of the property, he wanted to narrow it up. And the Planning Commission had the leeway to allow for that to be narrowed up. Well, as that was presented and the initial discussion got going, most of the planning commissioners were right off the bat, were like, no, not in favor of this. I think when you do that, you're going to restrict the ability of fire trucks to be able to get in there, and the garbage trucks, and and the mail and all the various things. And they were just like, no. And one of the planning commissioners who'd kind of been sitting there for a few minutes, he finally spoke up and he said, I actually saw a cul-de-sac very similar to this in another town, in another city, someplace where he had been. And he said, what they did is people had to take their garbage cans and either put them in the middle of the cul-de-sac or move them out to the end curb. They put all of the mailboxes out there. It actually worked quite well. He said, I didn't see a problem with it. When he said that, it turned that planning commission right around. All of a sudden, all of those other planning commissioners that had been against it, they were like, well, okay, maybe that will work. I guess that maybe is a good idea. And they wound up approving it. But when they started discussing it, I thought there was no way they were going to approve it. And then that one planning commissioner who kind of said what he did turned it around. So what that really argues for too, if you're on a body, a small body like a planning commission or on a council, don't keep quiet. You're there for a reason. And as you see things, as you have ideas, as you have thoughts, you really have an obligation because you're on the body and you're trying to help the body make better decisions. You really have some responsibility to share your ideas, share your thoughts, because it may help. It may not, but it may. And so, don't just sit there and not say anything. Say something. Get your thoughts out there and see what happens. It very well may make a difference in the end. So, all right, let's talk about the next factor, making conclusions independently. Let's go back to Len Fisher with his jar of jelly beans. So he then did another experiment. He went into pubs again with his jar of jelly. Well, actually, this time he used mint pieces. So irrelevant what it was, but he had a jar full of mint pieces and he went in. This time, instead of asking individuals to guess, he went to the tables, to each table in the pub, and he said, as a table, give me your guess of what's in this. How many pieces are in here? And the table as a group would discuss it and hammer it out, and then they'd finally agree, and then they'd come up with a number, and they'd express it. And he did that a number of times in a number of different pubs. The range was much smaller this time than when he did it with individuals. The range was 97 to 112. So not a very big range, only 15. The average number of guesses for the pieces in the jar was 105. That was the guess. The actual number that was in the jar was 147. They were off by a lot, much more so than when individuals made those guesses. What happened? We're going to talk about it. And you kind of nailed one of the things, but the way I characterize it, and the question I always ask when I get to this point is, obviously what happened was the table discussed it, right? And then they came up with a decision together. Did that discussion make the group dumber? I mean, aren't we supposed to have discussion? Isn't that what makes, part of what you're supposed to do? You as a planning commission, you're supposed to discuss things and come up with a decision as you work on these things together. So what's going on here? Why would that work out as a negative? For a small group, when you're doing those kinds of things, when you're having discussions about what you ultimately ought to decide, there are a number of things that go on. And while you may not be able to completely overcome them, you ought to be aware of them so that you can kind of see what's happening and decide, yeah, I see what's happening here. We shouldn't get into that. Let's talk about what some of those are. The first one is called what's cascade. All right. What a cascade is that you ask a group to make a decision or to do something, and the first person to speak up says something. Studies have shown that for decisions made by groups, more often than not, the group winds up making a decision that is what the first speaker said. More often than not. So being an early speaker is maybe a way to get your way, but is it necessarily the best decision? It's an interesting thing to kind of think about. I kind of liken this to something I used to do when my friends and I grew up in Salt Lake City, near Liberty Park, and we used to walk downtown to go to the movies. And when we would get downtown, one of our fun things we like to do is, as we were walking in downtown Salt Lake City, is we would suddenly just kind of slow down and we'd look up, and we just kind of look up in the sky. We go, wow. And people walking by, pretty soon they're slowing down and they're looking up in the sky. And pretty soon we got a whole bunch of people all standing there looking up in the sky. And then we'd run off laughing, and just like, look at what we did. But that's kind of how a cascade works. The first person says something, and pretty soon the whole group's going along with what that first person says. Why does that happen? Why does that happen? A few different reasons. Any of you want to guess what some of those reasons may be? Why would that happen?
This one, let's speak first.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, and why do you not want to? Why do you not want to speak first?
No, I'm just.
No, you're actually very right.
It was just a joke. We're all like, I don't want to be the guilty one now.
But why don't you want to speak first?
No, it was just, I saw that you were willing to speak. No, you speak.
But you're actually right.
I would just think that you have an assumption that the other person knows something you don't.
Yeah, that's right.
Fear of being wrong.
A lot of times what happens is somebody, when you're sitting there and you really don't know what to think, you're kind of like, gee, I don't know. Could be this way, could be that way. I'm not really sure how I feel about this or what I think. And when that first person speaks up, people go, oh, he or she must know what they're talking about. And if they know what they're talking about, I guess I'll go along with it. That's one. Another reason is people will sometimes do that because they don't want to be contrary, right? You may be sitting there thinking, I don't know, I think maybe kind of think this. And then that first speaker speaks up and says, okay, this is what I think. And you're sitting there going, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I really agree with that, but I don't want to be contrary. I'm not going to, challenge them. So I'll just go along with it. That happens a lot. It happens more than you think. And there's that pressure to conform. The first speaker says something. You're still sitting there thinking, yeah, right. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Then the second person speaks up and says, yeah, I agree. And then the third person speaks up. And then you're sitting there going, I'm not going to stop these people. So you just go along. So that's why this whole cascade gets going, and why groups more often than not make a decision that's in line with what the first speaker says. So it's something to be aware of, something you really need to take a look at and think about as that moves forward. All right, next. Now, one thing to be cautious of. Brandon here and Amy are early speakers. They give you a staff report, right? So they're early speakers. Yeah, great. That actually works pretty well. If you had Craig Call here and you probably hadn't done some other land use trainings, you know that there are two main kinds of decisions that you make as a planning commission, right? Legislative, administrative. For administrative decisions, these guys are giving you information that you need. Does it conform with the requirements of the ordinance or the code? How does it or how does it not? What needs to be changed if it needs to be changed? They're giving you information. Okay, that's good. You need that in order to make a decision. So they're giving you that. For legislative items, those things are much more opinion based, right? So what Brandon thinks, maybe it's good, maybe it's not. I always, it's interesting because when I started out my career as a planner, I always thought, yeah, I've gone to school, I learned all this stuff, I do all this reading. I know what's good for the community. And if those dang planning commissioners would just listen to me, they'd have a great town, they'd have a great city, but they don't always listen to me. And it always kind of bugged me, right? Well, I learned over the years that that wasn't necessarily the right answer or the best approach, because the community belongs to the people that sit on that body, and their opinions are just as valid as anybody else's. And so what is it that they really want to see for their community? So in that regard, early speakers, you have to be you have to think about it. You have to be careful when you're doing a legislative item and you listen to that early speaker. You have to really find yourself thinking, do I agree with that or not? And be much more critical of how you're looking at it and how you're thinking. So don't let Brandon sway you, all the time, especially on those legislative items, those changes to your plan or changes to your code or whatever. Ask them some tough questions. Why do you think that's a good idea? How is that going to make things better? What's it going to do? Get some of the thinking behind it and not necessarily hold up with it. Now, there's another interesting group of people that you hear from, and that's the public, right? Does this influence your thinking? Should it influence your thinking? Yeah, very, very true. Exactly right. On administrative items, I'm actually a big proponent, and if you read my latest entry on the blog that Brandon was talking about, I have been on this kick along with a number of other people for a few years now. We should not be having public hearings for administrative items, because what does the public do when they come to a public hearing? They give you their opinion. They like it, they don't like it. Usually they don't show up when they like it. They usually just show up when they don't like it, right? And they don't want it. Well, that's, if it's a conditional use permit application and they don't like it, but your code allows it. And if the applicant meets all of the requirements, you're obligated to approve it. And what that engenders with the public then is they feel like you're not listening to them. You're those dirty buggers, you already had your mind made up before they even got up to say anything. And, they told you all the reasons why you shouldn't approve it. And there you go. And you wind up approving it anyway. What are we engendering when we do that with those administrative items? So that's kind of the kick that I'm on with administrative items. I think we could create something else called an administrative hearing that has different rules about facts and evidence and so on, rather than opinion. Even that may be tough to hold to. But on legislative items, when the public speaks, should you be listening? Yeah, you should. But I'll tell you something, you probably ought to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. And why is that? Who shows up to your meetings? Usually the people that don't like it. And how big a part of the community are they? If the people who like it, they're like, yeah, I'm okay with it. I don't need to go to the meeting. There may be a whole lot more of them out there than the ones that are at the meeting. But it's something you kind of got to gauge and, decide on and work on with yourself and take that with a little grain of salt as you listen to that. And that's why, as we talk about this wisdom of crowd stuff, it actually really works best when you can make your own decision on your own to get a better outcome. But we have a system whereby we really encourage the discussion. So you got to take that discussion with a bit of a grain of salt. And maybe, you know, think about it critically with regard to what you were thinking from the very get-go. Another form of cascade is sequential voting. Take a look at these ladies. The lady there on the right, she's got her hand up, she's voting. These other ladies, you can see the one particularly on the left, she's kind of looking out of the corner of her eye, you know, what are those ladies doing? This idea of sequential voting, you don't necessarily get people's independent thought. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail because that's the third condition for getting a good outcome in this wisdom of crowds thing. But this is another form of cascade. I'm on the Kaysville Planning Commission. I've been now for a few years, ever since I retired. And the Kaysville Planning Commission has had this tradition of sequential voting. You know, they go, okay, you know, you first, and then go down the line and vote. Everything that I've even told them this is that's not a good way to do it. Because what you do is you wind up, the people that are down here, they kind of feel the pressure to go along with what the other people are voting. And so I encouraged them, you know, I said, now to think about changing that, but they haven't changed it. So it's tough to do sometimes, but it talks about it. So as another form of the cascades. All right. Group influence. The influence of a group on you as an individual. There was a 1950s study done about the dangers of group influence. It's a fascinating study. So have you guys seen it's kind of the perception thing where you have a line and it has arrows on it that go one direction, and then there's another line and it has arrows going the other direction. And what it does is it makes the one line look longer than the other, but they're actually both the same length. So it's a visual perception kind of a deal. All right. So they would show people these lines and ask them to decide whether those lines were the same length or not. And as people looked at it, and sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't, so that they could get a variety there. But as they asked people to look at that and make a decision on their own, 95% of the time they were right. They got it right as to whether the lines were the same length or not. Then they put those people in groups. And what they did is that they put people in groups with actors, people who were part of the experiment. And the other people in the group would deliberately pick the wrong line. They would say, no, this is not the same length, or it is the same length, even though they knew the opposite, but they did this just to see what would happen. Those the people that were not part of the actors, now they got the right answer only 25%. So they were very much influenced by the others in the group, and what they were saying was the right length, whether the line was longer or shorter. And the interesting thing about this was that later, when they got the capability, they did these fMRI studies to see what areas of the brain were kicking in. And the assumption was that it was the social area of the brain, that people were changing their choice because they wanted to not offend the group, be part of it, you know, just kind of try to be more agreeable or whatever. That wasn't the area of the brain that was actually kicking in. It was actually the cognitive area of the brain. What that basically was saying was people's actual perception was changed by what the group was saying. So it's really interesting, you know, something to be aware of. Not sure what you can do about it, other than just be aware that what a group thinks could very well affect what you think and what you perceive and how you see it. Another one is group polarization. Think about this when you're driving on the freeway sometimes and you're in a group of cars, right? And everybody in that group of cars tends to stay right where they are. And when the group starts to speed up, everybody in the group speeds up with it. And if they slow down, they all slow down with it. It's a tendency that we all kind of seem to have. that when we're in a group and we kind of know where we think we fit in the group, then we try to maintain our position in that group, even if that group changes its opinion, changes, in the case of the freeway, its speed. We go right along with the group and go in whatever direction that the group is going. And a lot of that happens because, again, you have that early speaker that says, you know, this is what I think. And then the next person says, yeah, I think so too. And then the next person says, I think so too. And I think so even more. And you know, pretty soon you're just grabbed right into that and become part of that overall tendency right there. Why is that a concern? Well, there's an aspect of this, if you go to the next slide, which is called the severity shift. This was something that's been studied about juries. As I said, I did this presentation long ago, and do any of you remember Michael Vick, the quarterback, who was doing the dog fighting thing? And he was, you know, later charged with that and convicted. What this cartoon shows is, you know, he's on trial with a jury of dogs. Well, what's going to happen to him with a jury of dogs? Well, what these studies have actually shown is this, and this is kind of how they wind up conducting them. They would ask people that were jurors before the trial started or whatever, if this person is found to be guilty, what do you think the appropriate punishment is? Or the appropriate fine or whatever. And people would give their opinion. You know, they say, this is what I think. Then later, if that was the decision of the jury, and then the penalty would come out, the jury would recommend a penalty. It was usually, oftentimes, way more severe than what each individual said that they individually thought would be the appropriate penalty. What in the world is going on? They call this the severity shift. It's where somebody says, yeah, I think he's guilty, and I think the penalty ought to be this. And the next person goes, yeah, I think he's guilty too. And I think it ought to be worse, that they ought to get more of a penalty. And then the next one says, well, I think even more than you do. And pretty soon that just cascades right down. So you wind up, you know, somebody getting awarded $15 million for spilling a hot cup of coffee in their lap at McDonald's, right? It's an issue. It's a problem. I have seen it happen with planning commissions. All right. You have a landscaping requirement and you say, you know, you have to put in viable trees and you have to, you know, do some good things with trees. So the first person says, great, I think you ought to put in, you know, 10 trees and they ought to be this caliper size. And then the next planning commissioner says, yeah, I agree with that. But I think you ought to put in 15 trees. And I think they need to be a little bit bigger. And then the next one says, oh, those trees, they ought to be providing shade right off the bat. You ought to put in 20 trees and they ought to be redwoods. You know, they need to be huge. I mean, it just kind of works its way down the line. And it's this severity shift that goes on. So it's really something to be aware of. And, you know, try to not let it influence you. You're probably going to make a better decision if you try to stick with where you were thinking, you know, early on in the process. So how do you keep groups from polarizing, or how do you depolarize groups? The main way is to do this. Here's that diversity thing again. Try to have at least one person in the group that doesn't think like the rest of the group. Now, sometimes that's hard to tell or hard to know how that would work. But again, you have a better chance of that happening if you have a diversity of types of people, backgrounds, and so on in a group. Because somebody in that group may then say, yeah, I don't agree with them, because they have a bit of a different background and a different thought process. Again, the studies show that a single person can make a difference to the outcome of a decision in a group. I call it the 12 angry men effect. You know, the one person can make a difference in the outcome. And most importantly, the studies show that non-polarized groups tend to make better decisions than groups that are polarized. So what does all this mean for discussion? Because a lot of what we're talking about, you know, is a result of discussing. And you all have discussions. You know, every planning commission, every council has discussions. Does this tell us it's a bad thing? Not really. Not as long as we're aware of some of these things that can go on. What's important is you have your thought at the beginning of the process. Hang on to your thought unless you see a good reason why maybe it ought to change. There was some interesting stuff done where people were presented an issue in a group or a body, and they were asked to write down what they thought ought to happen on this issue. Write that down right at the beginning. And then the body would go through its work and everything, and then they would come up with some kind of a decision. And then people were asked to look again at what they thought at the beginning. And a number of those people thought, oh, heck yeah. I actually think my position is a pretty good one. And it kind of helped change and modify what the decision ultimately wound up being, because people would go back to what they were thinking originally. But it can be beneficial, particularly if it brings out more information, stuff that you don't know already. It can be helpful in that regard. So, lastly, let's talk about this issue of how the decision is made. And I kind of alluded to that when we talked about those ladies and the sequential voting. But the key factor here is that the decisions are best made if they're done in a way that's screened or protected from the repercussions. What that really argues for is that the best way to get the thoughts of each individual in the group is to really have them write it down in secret, a secret ballot. That really seems to be, because then you're going to get the real thoughts of that individual. This, you know, especially because, I mean, you know, you sit there and you make a decision, and with a group looking at you and you're thinking, oh my gosh, you know, my neighbor's right there, and I know he's going to come over and really blast me if I vote this way. So maybe I won't vote that way because I don't want to be blasted by my neighbors. You know, but if they don't know what you voted, you're likely to vote what you really think. Yeah. So in Utah State Code, it says that the vote shall be, I've got it written down here. Utah Code says that the result of the votes of the public bodies is to be open, and that the vote of each member is to be recorded. So we really can't do it that way, right? You can sort of get at it. What you could really do is you could have the vote taken, have everybody write down their vote on a piece of paper. Everybody hands their paper to the chair tallies it up, says this is the vote. Doesn't say who voted what way. But then when you do your minutes, you know, you hand the slips to the recording secretary, and then they'll write down who it was, and it gets in minutes that way. So I guess that way you can be true to what the state code requires. And people can always look then afterwards, that ultimately you'll get found out how you voted. But in the meeting, it takes some of that pressure off. But I don't know of anybody who does that. I think it's just, maybe a step too far to try and do that.
I'm not sure if he's stated this, but even if like you looked at it anonymous and then they were read afterwards, so that, everyone's voting there. So in other words, you don't know the identity of someone they're voting until everyone's already voted.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do we do? Maybe the best way is just, I think it's the good old simultaneous vote. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say nay. That's probably the best we can do. Sequential voting is a no-no because that does that cascade thing. And I got to get my own planning commission to quit doing that. And that may be about, like I say, about as the best we can get. So, last slide. It's easy. Making these group decisions, it's not a perfect world. But if we're a bit aware of some of the various dynamics and factors that go into how we make these decisions, then maybe it'll help us to go, oh, wait, I shouldn't get caught up in this. I should express my opinion. I should vote the way I think I really feel. And let the consequences be what they may. Or make sure that you say what you think, because you kind of have an obligation to do that. And that's part of what helps craft what goes on. So there's a way to do it, but beware, that first person in your planning commission, what they're saying. If you don't agree with it, speak up. Speak up, because too often everybody just acquiesces. And that first speaker, the decision gets made. And all of those other things that we talk about, the severity shift, be careful of that, that you start going, yeah, well, we're going to add on, or we're going to add on. Maybe you're carrying things too far when you go that way. And best way to help with all of this is have a diversity of people on your commission. Get people with a variety of backgrounds and experiences. Really seems to help and work the best. So that's it. Any questions, any comments from y'all?
As we go back to the earlier slide that showed the books you had.
The books, yeah, sure. It's like the second or so slide, second or third. There we go.
Can I just add a couple comments? That's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny. I didn't expect to be bringing this up, but as you've been talking about these books and then these group dynamics, and I don't mean to take too dark of a turn in terms of content, but I just finished listening to a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And
oh boy,
totalitarianism is actually really different than say a dictatorship. It's where groups in society start enforcing certain cultural norms that they've decided on. And and as you've been presenting this, I keep thinking about it because it's like this large societal scale version of some of the dynamics that you're talking about. And it said that, when societies get to a point that they have some sort of anxiety about something that they can't resolve, they tend to pick someone to blame, and then that group gets persecuted. And the authors concluded that the one thing that prevents that society from getting totally wrapped up in that paranoia is the minority speaking up and sharing their point of view. And it seems to rehumanize to a degree the balance in society, right? And I just keep thinking about like I said, I'm not trying to get too dramatic because this is like that's a much more serious situation. But I hear the same message here, right? Like when someone who has a different point of view speaks up, it sort of swings a pendulum back to a more human and less fear-based or pressure-based perspective. And that's one of the main reasons why I think it's fair to say that I requested that Will come, because you hold a public trust. Even though you're an appointed official as opposed to an elected, you hold a public trust, and that's a sacred role in our republic, number one. And number two, the point being that you, in your administrative capacity, you're here to administer the law, not go by a personal opinion. And so, but you have this approval authority to administer that law, right? And so it's these decisions are so important that they come from a broad, well-rounded perspective so that law can be administered well and be the rule of law as opposed to the rule of persons and private will, if that makes sense. And that you're true to the principles that are enshrined in our law and our constitution, et cetera. So anyway, just a couple other thoughts. I don't know if the commission had any questions for Will.
thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
That was a new way to look at it.
yeah. Glad to do this. I'm always, it's good to get the information out.
We appreciate that information. Appreciate you coming and spending the evening.
Thanks. I'm going to take off.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's wrap up with a couple items. We want to do remarks from commission staff. Is there any other discussion points or items from the commission that we'd like to bring up? And as we turn into staff, and unfortunately, we don't have Sarah with us tonight, but as we turn to staff, just one quick question. Is there anything coming forward in the next month docket that are we looking for another big bunch of things on our plate? And second part is, we had a couple items, I think, that went before the city council. Is there any update on those items?
Ones that I can remember are the transportation. Minor changes. There were all the rezones that I'm recall were approved except for maybe one. I can't remember details on those, but I don't know if that's what you're asking about or not. As far as upcoming items, there will be more minutes that are forthcoming. Again, I'm hoping to get those completed with and then we have 3 or 4 applications that are that may be ready for the next planning commission. It will sort of depend on how they shake out. They're relatively, all of them but one that I can think of are relatively simple. They're site plan additions where they're just amending or adding onto a building or something to that effect. So
Which zoning did they not approve?
I can't remember the details, but I was just trying to rack my brain about what.
So they chose to go against our recommendation. Is that what it was?
I'd have to look back.
Okay.
It's been, the last zonings were, I think, in May.
I can pull.
We can get that. So you'd probably be faster than that. Okay, anything else from the staff?
I don't have anything. I guess,
Sarah Center regret.
She missed out. That was a good training. We appreciate that. Setting that up.
if you have preferences with regards to training subjects you'd like to learn about, I'm happy to, take that and see if we can cater anything.
Well, I think that the two of them was a good mix because one taught us the administrative and legislative. And then, I think the point was made again that, unfortunately, I feel sometimes bad when people come and flood the whole thing. We're like, well, you're at the wrong part of the process. It's too bad you don't come when we're making changes or making recommendations to changes to the council. And that's why it's too bad. I wish those people be involved a little bit sooner. And then they might have the opportunity to get up here instead.
But I will say this, which I think it was my second day on the job here at Pleasant View, there was a rezone at city council application being considered. And, there's the other side of the coin where you get, it's disappointing that people show up when legally they can't have that much influence on an administrative item. Another way that can be disappointing is when no one shows up for a legislative rezone application. And it was very heartening to see, a large group of people show up and see that, because it was like, oh yeah, this is the public process. Like they're having a voice at a time that they can have influence, and those two factors are matched so that, the community can have appropriate input. So it was very heartening when.
Okay, so we don't keep everybody going. I want to thank everybody again for coming tonight. I appreciate taking time. And I think we got a great commission here and I really appreciate everybody's effort. So with that, I'm entertaining a motion that we adjourn. All in favor, say aye. 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 I'm going to tell her who made the motion.
I did. Yeah, I'll make it.
David.
That's good.
Oh yeah, you're good.